Paul calls what follows in Galatians chapter 5 the works of the flesh. But his own list creates a problem with the way that phrase is usually understood. And if we get this category wrong, we can make Paul sound as if the body itself is the problem when his argument may be aimed somewhere deeper. Before we touch the ancient wording behind it, sort Paul's examples into two piles: things a body does and things a body cannot do on its own. Sexual immorality, impurity, debauchery, idolatry, sorcery, hostilities, strelicy, outbursts of rage, selfish ambition, dissensions, factions, envy, drunkenness, carousing. 15 items: sexual immorality, impurity, debauchery, drunkenness, carousing. 5 that clearly involve bodily appetite or bodily action. Now look at what remains. Envy is not an appetite. Faction is a loyalty. Idolatry is allegiance. Strife, jealousy, rage, selfish ambition, dissension. These can exist while the body is doing almost nothing. 10 of the 15 things Paul calls works of the flesh are not things flesh does. One textual note before we move on. If you are reading a King James Bible, your list may contain 17 items rather than 15 because its textual tradition includes adultery and murders. That does not rescue the bodily reading. Adultery moves into the bodily pile. Murder belongs with hostility and rage. The basic imbalance remains. And that gives us our first answer. But it opens the real question. Whatever Paul means by the flesh, a simple equation with the physical body cannot carry the passage, so now the ancient wording matters. Paul wrote this letter in Greek. The word behind flesh is sarx, but naming the Greek word does not solve the problem. If anything, it makes it harder, because Paul uses sarx in ways that refuse to stay inside one neat English definition. In Galatians alone, sarx appears 17 times. Across the New Testament, it appears roughly 150 times, depending on the printed Greek edition being counted. That wider total matters less than what happens inside this one letter, because Galatians lets us test Paul against Paul without leaving the argument that created the problem. Start near the end of the letter. Galatians 6, verse 13. Paul says the men pressuring these churches into circumcision want to boast in your flesh. That is physical. A circumcised body is being used as a visible credential. Nobody boasts in his sinful nature as a badge of covenant belonging. Now go backward. Galatians 2, verse 20. Paul speaks of the life I now live in the flesh and describes that life as a life of faith. No moral condemnation there. He is simply alive in a human body. Galatians 4, verse 13. Paul reminds them that he first preached to them because of a weakness of the flesh. Again, ordinary physical frailty, a body that failed him. Then Galatians 3, verse 3. Having begun by the Spirit, are you now being completed by the flesh? And here the context changes. The crisis in Galatia is not a discussion about food, sex, or bodily pleasure. It is pressure to secure Christian standing through Torah observance and circumcision. So inside one short letter, sarx can refer to a body, bodily weakness, a circumcised credential, and something set against the Spirit in a theological argument. That gives us something solid. Sarx is not one sealed compartment inside a person. Paul is using a flexible word whose meaning has to be determined by context, and this is where many explanations go wrong. They find one true meaning of sarx somewhere in Paul and quietly treat it as the meaning everywhere. Galatians itself will not allow that, but that does not yet tell us why he places flesh and spirit against each other. And before we chase the history of that contrast, Paul's own words force an objection we cannot skip. 5 verses after the list, Galatians 5, verse 24 says that those who belong to Christ have crucified the flesh with its passions and desires. Passions, desires. That sounds much more bodily. Romans 8 makes the tension sharper. Paul can speak in the same sentence about living according to the flesh and putting to death the deeds of the body. 2 Greek words are involved: sarx, flesh, and soma, body. They are not identical, but Paul can place them close enough together that any theory requiring a clean wall between them immediately gets into trouble. So we cannot solve this by saying flesh has nothing to do with the body. Sometimes it plainly does. A lexicon confirms the range: physical flesh, the body, kinship and descent, humanity, human frailty, and in some contexts an ethical sense. Useful, but still not enough. A dictionary tells you what a word can mean. It does not tell you which sense is active in a sentence, and it certainly does not explain why a Jewish writer in the first century repeatedly opposes this word to spirit. A lexical range gives us possibilities. We still need a conceptual world. That is the next question. Where did Paul get that opposition? If you want to trace this evidence yourself, Watchman members get the full study guide for this episode with the Greek and Hebrew word trail, key passages, cross-references, and verification links in one place. Join through the link in the description or the join button below. Now go back before Paul. The easy assumption is Greek philosophy, soul versus body, higher spirit trapped in lower matter. But Paul's conceptual world is Jewish before it is philosophical, and the Hebrew scriptures already have the contrast we need to examine. The Hebrew word basar means flesh, meat, body, living creature. Ruach means spirit, wind, or breath. Watch what happens when the Hebrew Bible puts them against each other. Genesis 6, verse 3. Humanity is described as flesh. That is not a moral accusation against the body. It is a statement of creatureliness. Human beings are mortal and temporary. Psalm 78 says God remembered that they were flesh, a passing wind that does not return. Then Isaiah 31, verse 3 makes the axis unmistakable. Egypt is man and not God. Its horses are flesh and not spirit. The contrast is not body versus soul. It is creature versus creator. Mortal strength versus divine power. In Genesis, being flesh means that human life is temporary. In the Psalm, flesh is remembered with compassion because it passes. In Isaiah, flesh names the weakness of the power Judah is tempted to trust instead of God. The shared idea is not matter is evil. The shared idea is the creature is not the creator. Now the ancient language clue becomes important in a much deeper way. Paul wrote in Greek, but the Greek Bible used by Greek-speaking Jews had already carried this Hebrew vocabulary across languages centuries before him. In the Greek translation of Genesis 6, verse 3, ruach is rendered with pneuma, spirit, and basar with a form of sarx, flesh. So the pair sarx and pneuma already existed in Paul's scriptural world before Paul used it. And this matters because it gives us more than a word match. It gives us a direction of thought. A Jewish reader could encounter flesh and spirit in Greek while carrying a Hebrew distinction about dependence, mortality, and the difference between human power and divine power. 2 verses before the works of the flesh list, Galatians 5, verse 17 places sarx and pneuma against each other. I am not claiming Paul is secretly quoting Genesis 6. The evidence does not require that. The point is narrower and stronger. Paul did not have to invent a flesh versus spirit opposition out of a Greek body versus soul philosophy. His Greek scriptures already use this vocabulary to carry a Hebrew contrast between human creatureliness and divine spirit, and it was not mechanical. Isaiah 31 does not preserve the exact flesh and spirit pair in the Greek translation. That matters because it stops us from pretending there is a one-to-one code everywhere. So the opposition is biblical before it is Pauline, and its older axis is creature versus creator. But that answer creates the next problem immediately. Creatureliness explains mortality. It does not yet explain why Paul can give flesh a moral charge, passions, desires, hostility, envy, selfish ambition. When did flesh begin carrying that weight? Before Paul, we can already see Jewish writers using flesh language for more than bare mortality. The community rule from the Dead Sea Scrolls can speak of ungodly flesh and of the sin of flesh. The Thanksgiving hymns can place flesh language near holiness language. That does not mean Paul copied the Dead Sea Scrolls. He did not need to read these texts at all. Their value is historical. They show that in Jewish thought around Paul's world, flesh could already carry the idea of weak human creatureliness with moral susceptibility attached to it. That is the missing bridge. We have now moved from a merely physical sense of flesh to creaturely weakness to a Jewish moral use in which that weakness can be spoken of as vulnerable to sin. The movement is historical, not magical, and we do not need to pretend every writer means exactly the same thing. A human being is flesh because a human being is mortal, limited, dependent. And in later Jewish usage, that weakness can be discussed not only as physical limitation, but as susceptibility to sin. Modern scholarship describes the same movement in different language. Translation scholar Robert Bratcher argued that Paul's ethical use of flesh points to the human being in alienation from God, not to one detachable part of the person. He also used the Galatians vice list itself to make the same observation we began with. Only a minority of the listed works are straightforward bodily sins. Craig Keener similarly emphasizes that the body itself is not evil, while human life can come under the power of sinful desire rather than God's Spirit. Now we are close to an answer that can actually survive the evidence. The evidence is pointing away from two selves trapped inside one body. It is pointing toward one whole person viewed under different governing realities. That is a major step, but it is still provisional. Before we call it the answer, it has to survive Paul's strongest counterexamples. If it cannot explain the passages where sarx is physical, ancestral, or tied to circumcision, then we have only replaced one oversimplification with another. In Galatians specifically, there is a serious alternative emphasis. Some of Paul's flesh language is clearly bound up with circumcision and Torah identity. Galatians 6 speaks of boasting in another person's flesh. Galatians 3 asks whether people who began by the Spirit will now be completed by the flesh. That means covenant identity marked in the body is not a side issue in this letter. Any reading that ignores it is incomplete, but it cannot be the whole story either, because the works of the flesh list includes jealousy, rage, rivalry, dissension, and envy. Circumcision does not explain those. Romans pushes both directions at once. Paul can speak of fellow Israelites as kinsmen according to the flesh, ancestry with no moral charge. Elsewhere, he can say that nothing good dwells in his flesh in a strongly moral context. The same author does not use sarx as a technical term with one fixed definition every time. That is exactly why the safest conclusion will have to be narrower than sarx means X. The question is not what sarx always means. The question is what Paul is doing with sarx when he places it against the Spirit. Colossians adds a useful corroboration, with the usual caution that its Pauline authorship is debated. It can speak of a person being puffed up by the mind of his flesh in a context of religious pride and asceticism. Whatever else that phrase means, it is difficult to reduce it to appetite. A body does not have sectarian pride by itself. And now we can return to the English phrase many readers learned: sinful nature. The 1984 New International Version often used sinful nature for sarx in Paul's letters. In the 2011 revision, the translation committee changed most of those occurrences back to flesh and explained that sinful nature could mislead readers into imagining the human person as a set of compartments, one of which is the sinful nature. That change matters because it shows the problem was not hidden. Translators themselves publicly recognized that a narrow English phrase could make Paul's anthropology look tidier than it is. Sinful nature can sound like a component installed inside a person. Flesh is harder, but the difficulty is honest. The reader has to let context do the interpretive work rather than receiving a ready-made compartment from the English phrase. And the basic observation is much older than modern translation debates. Augustine noticed that Paul's works of the flesh list contains many vices that are not bodily pleasures at all. He used the list to argue against blaming the body as though the body itself were the source of sin. So this is not a newly discovered secret teaching. It is an old interpretive problem that becomes easier to see once you stop forcing one English meaning onto every use of sarx. By this point, any final answer has to explain all of the evidence at once. The non-bodily vice list, the physical uses of sarx, the flesh-spirit contrast, the Hebrew background, the Greek transmission, the moral development, and the English translation problem. Now, the final claim can be stated without making Paul cleaner than he is. Sarx is not simply the body, but sarx does sometimes mean the physical body. It is not a separate evil self hidden inside you, but in Paul's moral and spirit versus flesh passages, it can describe the human person as living from mortal, creaturely weakness in a condition susceptible to sin rather than governed by the Spirit of God. The body is involved because the whole person is involved. The body is not the enemy. That is why Paul's list can be called works of the flesh, even when most of the items are jealousy, rivalry, rage, faction, and envy. He is not listing what skin and muscle do. He is describing what human life produces when it is operating from the flesh rather than from the spirit. And that is also why the opposite of flesh is not having no body. Paul himself lives faithfully in the flesh. The opposite is life governed by the Spirit. Read the chapter again with that distinction in view. The works of the flesh and the fruit of the Spirit are not two substances inside you fighting for space. They are two sources of rule showing themselves through one human life. And if you want to test the argument rather than merely accept it, go back to the list we started with. Count it. Then read every occurrence of sarx in Galatians and ask whether body, sinful nature, or any other single English gloss can survive all 17 uses without breaking. It cannot. That is the point the ancient language reveals. Paul did not reduce the flesh to your body, and he did not describe a hidden second self inside you. He was naming human life in its creaturely weakness when it stands under the power of sin rather than under the Spirit of God. But that makes one of Paul's most famous lines harder to hear the old way. If the body itself is not the enemy, what exactly does he mean when he says, "I am crucified with Christ"? That is the question I unpack in the video on screen now.